Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Erica Perrell, and I'm the Communications Manager with APEC. I would like to begin by acknowledging while we're gathering virtually this morning, we are all on lands which are the traditional and unceded territory of various First Nations. As you know, for the past number of years, APEC has been doing considerable research on the impact of Indigenous communities and businesses in the region, which you can find on our website. Our current series and the focus of today's webinar is on how Indigenous businesses and communities can recover from the effects of the pandemic and contribute to and benefit from long-term economic growth opportunities in the Atlantic region. I'll post a link to all of this research in the chat shortly. I have a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we begin. A copy of the presentation for today's session is already available on the event page. This is also where you'll find a recording of today's session. It should be available by tomorrow morning, and I'll post a link to that in the chat shortly as well. Speaking of the chat, as you listen to our session this morning, it's a lot of information. So if you think of any questions at any point in time, you don't need to hold on to them. Feel free to pop those into the chat, and we'll do our best to answer those during the Q&A portion a little bit later on. And with that, I'd like to hand the virtual microphone over to APEC's President and CEO, David Shandy, who will host and moderate today's session.
Well, thank you, Erica, and welcome everyone to this session. I know many of us have been on many webinars and eager to get back to in-person events. The one advantage of APEC continuing to do these webinars pre-COVID and post-COVID is it allows us to reach such a large audience. So we have people joining us today from across Atlantic Canada, including some people from Ontario, as well as Western Canada. So welcome to you all. And as Erica mentioned, we've been doing extensive research on Indigenous communities and businesses and how they can succeed. We've continued that during COVID. And we are now in another research series, and we are talking about some of the challenges Indigenous communities and businesses face, but we're trying to focus as much on the solutions and how do we help them grow, how do we benefit from their contributions that they can make. So that's the focus of today's webinar. We have a panel assembled to be able to provide some insights and share their perspectives and their wisdom. But before we do that, we would like to hear from you. So we actually have a polling question that we would like to poll and to suggest, if Eric can just move to the next slide. So what we'd like you to do is to share from your perspective, what is the single most important priority to grow the Indigenous economy? This poll is anonymous. You can just click on your response. You should be able to hopefully see that on your screen right now. So just take a second from your perspective, wherever you stand, whatever your engagement has been, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, from your perspective, what is the most important priority to help Indigenous businesses, individuals, communities grow and to help them benefit the broader Atlantic region? So I see those responses coming in quite quickly. I will give you another 20 seconds just to think through your top priority. Of course, many of these are important, but we've just highlighted education and skills, access to capital, housing infrastructure and broadband, Indigenous procurement opportunities, as well as partnerships, which will be the focus of today's session. So I'll just give you the last 10 seconds. I think most of you have taken an opportunity to participate. So let me close the poll and share the results with you. And there's really kind of two front leaders here in the responses. So education and skills and partnerships and building capacity, they're very much related, but those are clearly the top two choices and responses from our audience today. And we will certainly be talking about those as we go through, as well as some of those other aspects we've talked about in terms of capital and infrastructure and the role of procurement. So to help us address some of these issues, and particularly how we build partnerships, how do we help on the skills development, both of those will be tackled in our session today. What we would like to do is introduce our panelists. So our first speaker will be Fred Bergman. Fred is our senior policy analyst, and beyond the economic analysis that he does for APEC on a regular basis, he leads our relationships with Indigenous communities and organizations, and he's been leading our research on this topic. So he will be sharing some of the highlights from our current research series that we have underway. And one of the themes that has come out of that research has been the importance of partnerships. And so Fred will kind of share some of his lessons and best practices that we've identified. we will then turn over to our external guests who will share some of their insights on the partnerships that they are actually involved in. So we will hear from Andrew John, who's the Director of Justice and Legal Affairs with the APEC First Nation in Newfoundland. We will then, and that's kind of very much based on the ocean sector, we will then hear from Robert Apold, who's the Executive Director with Natural Forces, has been doing a lot of work in the energy sector, particularly in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. We then hear from Wanda Jarrett Compton, who's the PTEC Project Manager with the Mi'kmaq Economic Benefits Office, or MEBO, and they will talk about some of the work that they've been doing in the tech sector. And then finally, we'll hear from Lynn Clark, who's the leader with the IBM Client Innovation Center here in Nova Scotia, and she will again talk about their partnership with MEBO on their current PTEC program initiative. So those are the people that will be sharing their insights. And as Erica mentioned, after everyone's had a chance to share, we will have time for Q&A. So as you hear speakers and you have questions, just put them in the chat. And with that, we will move straight on and introduce Fred to share his remarks and presentation. Thank you, Fred.
Yeah, thank you, David. Gwei, welcome everyone to today's presentation on APEC's research on growing your business, the importance of Indigenous partnerships. David, in terms of the polling question, in relation to education and skills development, on average, Indigenous peoples have lower educational attainment. In 2016, only about 11% of Atlantic Indigenous persons had a university degree, compared to 24% of the non-Indigenous people in the region. In terms of building capacity through partnerships, partnerships are a great way for Indigenous businesses to enhance their supply chain capacity to be able to win procurement contracts, including in the private and public sector. In terms of the outline for today's presentation, this research series of 4 Indigenous reports in today's webinar are funded by the Atlantic Policy Congress of First Nations Chiefs Secretariat under the Atlantic Indigenous Economic Development Integrated Research Program. APEC's Indigenous research partners were the Ulnaweg Development Group and the Joint Economic Development Initiative. Today's presentation outline includes the post-COVID recovery, our first report in this series, broadband access, our second report in this series, Indigenous partnerships, our third report, and the Indigenous youth labor market, our fourth report. APEC's first report, next slide please, Erica, looked at key drivers and trends that have been affecting Indigenous communities and businesses and how COVID-19 has accelerated some of these trends. As shown in this chart here on the left, the decline in Indigenous business revenues was starting to dissipate as the pandemic wore on, at least prior to the Omicron variant hitting last winter. However, as of last summer, there were still serious financial pressures on Indigenous businesses in Canada. Since 2019, Indigenous employment off reserve in Atlantic Canada has increased by about 11%, but this excludes on-reserve employment. The unique challenges and opportunities that exist in Indigenous communities and businesses were discussed in the first report to shed light on what needs to be done to help these businesses and communities and what they can uniquely offer to the rest of the economy. Indigenous communities and businesses face numerous long-term challenges, including access to housing and infrastructure. In 2016, almost 1 in 5 Indigenous people lived in an overcrowded household, compared to 1 in 12 of the non-Indigenous people. Access to capital. Barriers to access to capital include the higher cost of doing business that Indigenous businesses face, lower rates of financial literacy, and complex government funding regimes that make it difficult to find programs that they may be eligible for. Ulnaweg Development Group supported over 70 businesses in 2020 and has provided $5,000 grants to businesses to help them navigate COVID-19 emergency programs from other sources. In terms of education and skill levels, through 2018 and 2019, 23% of off-reserve Indigenous youth age 20 to 24 were not educated, employed, or in training, compared to 12% of the general Canadian youth population. Building capacity. APEC estimates that in fiscal year 2020-2021, Atlantic Indigenous businesses accounted for only 0.4% of the $625 million awarded under the set-aside program for Aboriginal business with the federal government. In terms of partnerships, just 6% of non-Indigenous businesses had a formal long-term partnership agreement with an Indigenous business in 2017 in Canada. APEC's second report examined gaps in high-speed internet access between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and how to narrow the digital divide. In 2019, about 93% of First Nations communities in New Brunswick had access to the minimum 50 megabyte per second download and 10 megabyte per second upload speed standard, which was the highest level of access in Canada. Remote Indigenous communities in Newfoundland and Labrador, on the other hand, had access to a minimum 5 megabytes per second download speed and a 1 megabyte per second upload speed, because many of the Indigenous communities in Newfoundland and Labrador are in remote areas. Outside of New Brunswick, access to 5010 speeds was worse on reserve than in rural communities within the same province. Indigenous broadband access, however, improved from 2019 to 2021 across the Maritimes. For example, PEI improved from 30% in 2019 to 34% last year with 5010 access. Nova Scotia improved from 44% in 2019 to 57% last year with 5010 access. And New Brunswick improved from 93% in 2019 to almost 98% in 2021 with 5010 access. Maritime Indigenous communities are expected to be fully connected to the minimum 5010 standard by the end of next year, and Newfoundland and Labrador sometime between 2026 and 2030. By 2030, however, the 5010 standard will likely be out of date, as many internet customers are already accessing gigabit speeds, which are 20 times faster than the existing standard. APEC's third report discussed key growth sectors in Atlantic Canada that have strong relevance to Indigenous communities and businesses, including best practices for sustainable partnerships. The first step for engagement with Indigenous partners is commitment to reconciliation. Trust is everything for these partnerships, so it is important that interested businesses have the best intentions and shared values with their Indigenous partner or partners. Maximizing community benefits is a key part of desirable partnerships with Indigenous groups. Engagement with Indigenous groups should happen early during the planning phase of any proposed project. Plans need to be developed from the beginning with the affected Indigenous groups at the table. This will foster shared understanding and trust. Doing research on Indigenous partnerships shows due diligence and an authentic approach to the relationship and removes the burden from Indigenous groups having to educate others. Indigenous workers may need to be trained to be able to meet their commitments in a project, especially more technical projects where experience may be lacking. Capacity building also entails building connections such as better supply chain access. Indigenous partners want long-term employment opportunities during operations, not just short-term jobs during the construction phase. However, partnerships initially built on short-term projects can still develop into long-term partnerships through continued collaboration and engagement. Next slide, please, Erica. Some of the key growth sectors examined in our third report are discussed in these next two slides. Indigenous fishing enterprises in Canada generated almost $160 million in gross revenues and reported about 2,800 jobs in 2020, according to the National Indigenous Fisheries Institute. Indigenous communities and businesses are leaders in environmental and conservation stewardship. The protection of wild fish stocks is paramount for the sustainability of the fishing sector. Clearwater Seafoods was purchased for about $1 billion by the Mi'kmaq Coalition and Premium Brands Holding Corporation in 2021. Each party acquired 50% ownership, with the Mi'kmaq accessing capital through the First Nations Finance Authority to finance the transaction. This deal marked a landmark change in participation of the Mi'kmaq in Canada's offshore fishery sector. The Atlantic Indigenous tourism sector generated almost $52 million in real gross domestic product and employed about 1,500 people in 2021, according to the Conference Board of Canada. An Indigenous-led policy and growth strategy is essential to the prosperity and sustainability of the Indigenous tourism sector. The Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada partners with provincial Indigenous tourism organizations and with Destinations Canada. The federal government invested about $50 million from the Tourism Relief Fund in 2021 to support Indigenous tourism businesses. It also committed an additional $20 million over 2 years to create a new Indigenous tourism fund in the latest budget. It also committed almost $5 million over 2 years to the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada to support its operations. These three sectors will be discussed in more detail by our panelists this morning. Atlantic Canada's ocean technology sector supports more than 350,000 jobs in the region and over half of the country's $30 billion ocean economy as of 2020. The ocean technology sector can be challenging to get involved in due to technical requirements and high capital costs. highlighting the importance of partnerships and support from industry associations such as Canada's Ocean Supercluster or COVE. Atlantic Canada's clean technology sector real gross domestic product was $1.7 billion in 2019. The sector employed about 15,000 people in that year, according to a recent APEC study. Some of the benefits of clean technology and green energy projects include own source revenues, employment, and supply chain opportunities, and increased capacity for future projects. Atlantic Canada's digital technology firms generated about $3.4 billion in nominal gross domestic product in 2017, according to APEC research. This accounts for about 3% of our region's overall economy. Some Indigenous persons face barriers to participation in digital technology due to lower educational attainment and digital skills confidence. The Joint Economic Development Initiative has offered training programs since 2012 to enable participation in digital industries. They offer programs in big data, cybersecurity, mobile application development, and more. APEC's fourth report in its latest Indigenous research series will examine opportunities for Indigenous youth within regional growth sectors, including the sectors APEC looked at in its third report. Federal government support programs include the Indigenous Skills and Education Training Program, the Skills and Partnership Fund, and elements of the Youth Employment and Skills Strategy. To support the growth of Indigenous communities and foster lifelong learning, skills development, and training, the government of Canada has committed to the creation of the Indigenous Skills and Employment Training Program. The Skills and Partnership Fund is a project-based fund that supports partnerships between Indigenous organizations and industry employers to provide skills for Indigenous peoples linked to economic opportunities at the local, regional, and national level. The Youth Employment and Skills Strategy has two Indigenous program streams, including the First Nations and Inuit Skills Link program and the First Nations and Inuit Summer Work Experience program. These programs are for Indigenous youth aged 15 to 30. So how can partners foster successful human resource strategies and economic development with Indigenous peoples? Employment services and training that takes place with Indigenous communities tends to be more successful, but it is not always feasible. It allows clients to live in their home and be near family and community. This includes access to professional development, mentorship, training, skills certification, and employment opportunities. Likewise, cultural awareness and sensitivity training should happen across the entire organization, including boards, management, and frontline employees. This is paramount to ensuring a safe and welcoming work environment that fosters diversity, equity, and inclusion. It also means providing rewarding career and training opportunities while upskilling Indigenous workers for the jobs of tomorrow and not just the low-skilled jobs of today. Where possible, create a pool of Indigenous mentors and elders for youth to consult with as they make their career choices or seek advice in the workplace. Now back to our moderator to introduce our great panel. Lalio, thank you.
Well, thank you, Fred. And just to highlight, our third report on partnerships was released this morning. That is available on our website. If you're an APEC member, you would have had access to that in advance. It's one of the benefits of APEC membership. So Fred's kind of highlighted the broad picture and three of the sectors that we now want to delve into, beginning with Andrew John, who's going to talk about their work in the ocean sector. Thank you. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, David. So yes, my name is Andrew John, and I'm with Mi'kmaq First Nation. I'm the in-house legal counsel, and as a part of that, I also sit on the board for Mi'kmaq Horizon Maritime Services. Just a bit about our community, as Fred indicated in his report, we are a remote community. We're approximately 2 hours away from the Trans-Canada Highway on the coast of southern Newfoundland. We have approximately 832 on-reserve members, and as he indicated, access to things like employment and has always been a challenge for our nation. We focused on the traditional economy, and it sort of evolved approximately 20 years or so when the nation realized that we needed own source revenue to do the types of social programs that we wanted to do. The way that we evolved was, of course, we leveraged our strengths. The first strength that we leveraged was our traditional hunting and we evolved that into non-resident guiding and outfitting. However, a few years ago, we partnered with Horizon Maritime Services through essentially, as Fred mentioned, trust within our partners and personal relationships. Number one, with my predecessor Shane McDonald, and number two with Sean Leet, who is the CEO of Horizon Maritime Services. They recognized that they wanted to create and prosperous endeavor and include the nation as part of reconciliation. And that's something that the nation has always been excited about, and we want those long-term partnerships. But we realize that employment isn't enough. Employment is a great thing because we have a long history of maritime services, and simply because of our location, we leveraged our ability at sea to get those jobs. So we have training in kind of a unique field. So it was a natural fit to partner with Horizon Maritime Services, and as indicated, be successful in those procurement strategies by adding that Indigenous component, because we want to be a true partner with Horizon Maritime Services. And that became the impetus for Miabagig Horizon Maritime Services. And as you can see there through the picture is our lovely boat, the Polar Prince. We are the only First Nation who owns a certified icebreaker that's been retrofitted to host a variety of research and other contracts for the Canadian Coast Guard. So this is a long-term thing, because obviously an icebreaker is going to cost a lot of money. Now, of course, as I said, employment isn't enough. We need revenue sharing, and that's also important to the nation, because, again, as a part of that true partnership, that revenue sharing allows us as a nation to essentially determine which direction we go. We have control over our self-determination now, because we're in a position to do so. We're in a position to invest in other endeavors due to this partnership, and we're able to give back. Now, certainly that also allows us as a nation to provide for things like social programming, medications that are not covered by non-insured health benefits, and also as well other initiatives that we want to do with a view to our indigeneity, as you can say. So it allows us to practice our own methods of conservation. So that's a little bit about Miabagig Horizon Maritime Services. It's been a successful partnership and has brought real benefits to the nation in terms of long-term employment in sectors that we have traditional knowledge in, and certainly revenue sharing for the nation, which is desperately needed, as we're a small remote community with very little own source revenue otherwise. So that's the crux of my presentation. So I would hand that back to David.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and great to kind of see that journey that your nation has been on as they kind of see the need to grow revenues, but also leverage their skills and form those partnerships. So that's great to hear that story. So now I'd like to hand over to Robert to talk about what's been happening in the energy sector at Natural Forces.
Hi, David. Thanks very much for having me. I'll quickly go through, actually quite a detailed thing, but anyways, let's go through it. This is a shameless plug of what Natural Forces has been working on. We have over 300 megawatts of operational wind and solar. But the most important thing to look at on the slide is that we have 8 operational projects with true First Nation partnerships. That means over 50% ownership by each of the First Nations in those projects. And we have thousands of projects in early and late stage development across Canada, the US, and Ireland. I think one of the other important things is to realize that we also have about 35 partnerships with other First Nations on projects working across Canada. So something that we're really proud of. Next slide. The secret to our partnership is, we believe, is our philosophy. The first part is really understanding what each party is looking for out of the partnership. So many times, I know early in my career in dealing with Indigenous and First Nation partners, it was very much not listening to each other's needs. And truly, it's not just an economic need always that is coming out of the partnership. Sometimes it's job creation, sometimes it's own source revenue, sometimes it's supply chain. Understanding all those pieces and how they fit together, and also what we're looking for, which is long-term ownership together. So nurturing that relationship very early on is important to ensuring that we have a long-term success. One of the big parts also is making sure everybody understands what the risk is that is associated with each of these projects. So First Nations and Indigenous groups, their money is very precious because it goes towards a lot of social programs. And so taking huge risks early on in the process for development projects is a difficult decision. So in our partnership, what we try to do is we take that early risk only on ourselves, and their risk is they're risking in partnering with ourselves. So it's not a monetary risk, it's more of a partnership risk in terms of did they pick the right partner. And so we work together, we take the financial risk at the early, and then only at the time when the project is going into construction, do they take some of the financial risk that goes along with it, which is much more de-risk situation. Another part is understanding financial contributions from each partner. Sometimes at the very early stages, you'll notice that the numbers look quite large. And so understanding that the First Nation may have to find millions of dollars. So helping them through that process of looking for grants, whether looking for other ways of funding, for example, like the First Nation Finance Authority, those pieces to bring it together so that they can be that equal partner in the business. And finally, is we have to have a true commitment to deliver on the promised obligations from each partner. So sometimes we have very difficult discussions at the early stage. We find that those difficult discussions end up giving us a much better partnership. I would add I want to just put a little bit more color into our projects are really focused mainly on own source revenue. And why do we usually say own source revenue? Well, because you can't really make the wind go in a certain location. So sometimes the locations are farther away from the community than where people want to, than would be okay for them to drive to. So we always say with our partners that let's look at this at own source revenue and then look for the opportunities on the side to have, supply chain and job creation on the side. Next slide. So as I said, what are the secrets to great partnerships? Number one, be honest and transparent about what each project partner is going to get out of it. Make sure that you're equal partners. So many times we see others using a waterfall effect where they say, we'll put the money in and you'll get the extra. That really just means a royalty stream. And while royalties are interesting, we really believe in partnership because partnership has a different feel than just a royalty stream. And finally, making sure that you use each partner's strengths to the best effect. So, the ability to take risk, that is a natural forces risk financial risk. Social license, that is much more on the community side of it. And technical expertise would be on our side and local expertise would be on the nation side. Next slide. So there's not really any secret sauce to this. It's a very simplistic partnership. And we believe that simplistic partnerships make the best partnerships. Everybody is treated the same. Everybody has their share. It's not different shares, it's the equal shares. And we walk the path together. So true equity partnership, representative equally in all respects, and no partner is above the other partner. And what that means is that you have true communication, you have an ability to sit down and discuss issues instead of issues just being pushed across onto the Indigenous partner. Next slide. So this is one example of one of our recent projects that we did with Tobic First Nation. It's a 20 megawatt project up and running, has a 30-year power purchase agreement with New Brunswick Power, and was about $45 million capex. Tobic First Nation is a 51% owner in this project. The checks have been flowing for the past 2 years, and everybody's quite happy because everybody knew what was coming out of it. And when we think of this project, the First Nation will be gaining over $1 million per year of own source revenue from the single project, which is, as from what the chief tells me, that's a game changer for them because that money goes straight into the social programs that they want to do. So own source revenue is a definite checkbox. Then the second one is a job creation. So on this project is actually about 3.5 hours away from the community. But just the same, we were able to get about a little south of 10 members on the project to work during the construction. From that, some were working on the actual installation of the turbines, some were in the security piece, and some were on the bolting of the towers together. So quite interesting on that side. And then finally, Indigenous owned companies. There was one company that was completely Indigenously owned, which was the security company, which employed about 20 people on site. We also have, as part of this project, is an open way for anybody from the community who wishes to join the operations team, that they have to, we have a scholarship set up so that anybody can go to Holland College to do the education and then come on, get training, and then actually work across the country in the wind farm business, which is quite interesting. The issue, of course, there is that a lot of people like to stay in community, and the job, unfortunately, is not in community. It is outside of community, usually in Moncton or St. John. And that's the end. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. I do appreciate those insights there, and particularly your emphasis on kind of those true equal partnerships, and that every kind of partner has an opportunity to bring something unique to the table. So it's great to see how you're leveraging that in the energy sector. So we've talked about ocean technologies, we've talked about wind and energy. So Wanda, why don't you help us understand what's happening in the tech sector?
Certainly. Good morning, everyone. It is so lovely to be here with you all this morning. My name is Wanda Compton. I am the Unama'ki PTech Program Manager for MEBO. MEBO stands for the Mi'kmaq Economic Benefits Office. We've been around for approximately 15 years. We started in 2007, and our first major project was the tar ponds remediation project, where we employed Indigenous skilled workers on that project. Since that time, we have focused on skilled trades training and apprenticeship training, and we have workers in major projects right across Nova Scotia. So even though we're based here in Member 2 on the beautiful Unama'ki, which is Mi'kmaq for Cape Breton, we do work with Indigenous members in community across the province. We also work with entrepreneurs and Indigenous community members who would like to start a business or expand their business. And as of late, we are focusing on the digital economy and looking at the opportunity and the need for labor force development in the ICT sector in the province. We work with industry, government. It is a true partnership representing and community members. Next slide. I was hired in 2019 as the Unama'ki PTech Program Manager. And since that time, we did launch the program. And even though we had a worldwide pandemic, we still managed to launch our program, which we're very proud of. Now, PTech stands for Pathways in Technology, Early College, High School. It is a program of IBM, our technology partner, and a partner in the true sense of the word. And Lynn will talk about how that came about later. But PTech is in about 300 schools across the globe, which represents about 200,000 students. So our students are part of a global worldwide education system. And what that means is that it first started in Brooklyn in about 10 years ago. And so what that means is that it's providing education accessibility for underrepresented groups in the STEM fields. And we do know that there is a great demand for labor force development in those areas. So we started with IBM, and since that time, the partnership also includes the Nova Scotia Community College, which is our college partner, and MK, which is basically our education governance in the Mi'kmaq communities across Nova Scotia. Our students are going to graduate with their high school diploma and a 2-year Nova Scotia Community College IT web programming diploma at no cost. They will have an opportunity for mentorships, internships, and first in line opportunity for a job with IBM. Our first cohort has 15 students and across 3 communities here in Unama'ki. And it's what we call a pilot because it is something that we want to grow across other communities in Nova Scotia. And so with that, the next slide, please. The partnership advantage. You've heard a common theme this morning, and I'm going to reiterate that, and that it is important to have invested interest in the partnership. And we have been very fortunate to have very strong partners who are working towards a common goal of graduating these students in this program. And when I started in 2019, this program basically did not exist. And we are making history with having the first Mi'kmaq PTech program in the world. And we're very proud of that. And we have very dedicated, hardworking students in this program. We're not only taking their high school courses, within that day, they're also taking their Nova Scotia Community College level courses. They've completed 2 college level courses so far. So with that, when I started, it's about asking, it's about listening, it's about learning, and leading from that. It's building capacity in our communities so that the youth of those communities can stay and work in community and still be employed in the ICT sector. If they wish, they can. They do have a first in line job opportunity with IBM. They can continue on with further education, post-secondary education. They are becoming mentors and role models for upcoming youth in the community. And we, as a whole, are creating and contributing to the Nova Scotia economy and creating a diverse and inclusive workforce. So we are a growing population, contrary to the opposite of our population in Nova Scotia. So it makes perfect sense to tap into our Indigenous communities. And the guidance and wisdom of our chiefs and council saw that and saw the opportunity that PTech was going to offer youth in the communities. And they gave us the direction and the leadership to make this happen. And so far we are on our path, and we hope in future, as I said, to have a second cohort and with strong partners like IBM, like Nova Scotia Community College, like MK, like the Eskazoni School Board, and all the other communities we work with. And yeah, that's PTech in a nutshell. And I'll take some questions in the Q&A further to that.
Great. Well, thank you, Wanda. And it's great to hear that this is the first of the kind in a global program in this initiative. So that's great to hear. And very much tapping into kind of your responses at the beginning with our polling question, the need for skills and education development and the partnerships. And we've got both of those priorities kind of here coming together in this specific program. So we've got one more speaker to hear from. We will then go to the chat. So if you have some questions that you would like to ask of one of our panelists, we encourage you to take a moment right now and put that question in the chat. We will try to respond to as many of those questions as we can. So we've heard from Mibo around kind of their involvement and the nature of the program. Now I'd like to hand over to Lynn with IBM to get their side of the story and their kind of interest in this partnership and program that they've been working with. Over to you, Lynn.
Great. Thanks, David. So to set the tone, IBM's national strategy for supporting the progress of Indigenous communities in Canada is really built on that foundation of partnership and collaboration, and we address it across 4 key areas. So in this area, human resources and talent attraction, and we also focus on business development, community relations, and procurement. So fundamental to ensuring the success of this strategy is the role that IBM Canada plays in building the these relationships with the federal, provincial, and Indigenous governments to create this forum for discussion on technology topics and the opportunities and the challenges that are faced by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people of Canada, and building these relationships with the Indigenous communities. So in aligning with that national strategy and recognizing locally in Nova Scotia our continued need for skilled talent, we actually began back in the fall of 2016 to work with MEBO and to discuss ways that we could partner with the Unama'ki First Nation communities of Cape Breton. So this is where the concept of PTech really first arose, and Alex Paul enthusiastically brought this idea forward and quickly had the chiefs and council's support, as Wanda mentioned. So to be honest, this partnership has actually been quite easy. All of the partners have come on board and been extremely dedicated. We've really built a strong sense of trust and listening, understanding what the desired outcomes were, and all have been committed to driving this long-term success. So of course, there have been some delays and some disappointments along the way, but by us establishing early on this steering and working committee, we have invested stakeholders that have successfully launched and tracked this first cohort through to the successes that Wanda has mentioned. So in addition to the importance of business commitment to the Indigenous strategy and this community partnership to build trust and engagement, our local success with PTech also requires an engaged workforce to provide the mentorship and activity support. So I have a team of almost 900 IT professionals here in Nova Scotia, and 50% of those hires come directly from post-secondary. So the Unama'ki PTech students can see themselves in our young professionals and learn more about career opportunities and what's possible right here in our region. We have a really large team of dedicated volunteers who are equally committed to these successful outcomes, and this also increases their sense of purpose and pride as an IBMer. So our students are continuously meeting and exceeding the outcomes, and we're really excited to move into the next phase. So Wanda mentioned around paid internships and hopefully eventual employment with IBM. So as part of our commitment, we do offer guaranteed job interviews, but I have no doubt that there's going to be fierce competition among our industry partners locally to secure this bright talent. I also expect to see some innovative entrepreneurial pursuits in home communities and a desire to pursue further education. So this partnership, it's about preparing this next generation for new digital technology and a new business future for the communities. So thanks so much for the opportunity to share about our wonderful partnership, and back to you, David.
Well, thank you, Lynn, very much for sharing kind of your perspective and kind of your involvement in this. It's great to see that program up and running here in this region. So this is the time where we've got over 10 minutes for some questions. This is a chance for you to pose your questions. Maybe you've tried partnerships, and maybe you're looking at partnerships. Other things that our panelists can help share their perspective and experience with you. So if you can put those questions in the chat, we will try to address as many of those questions as we can. Let me just start off with some. Robert, if I can go to you first, and I'll just maybe invite all our panelists to turn on their videos so we can kind of quickly jump in here. But Robert, you talked about kind of a partnership model. Do you always use the same specific type of partnership, or does the model vary with the community you're working with or the type of project? Can you just elaborate on, is that a flexible that adjusts, or is that a kind of fairly standard model used in every situation?
Yeah, thanks, David. No, actually, our model changes depending on what the needs are for the community. For example, the large utility scale projects tend not to be in community and tend to be more own source revenue type projects. But more recently, if you look at Eskasoni with our partnership on Eskasoni Renewables, which is really doing field services for installation of solar and storage projects across the Maritimes, that's more of an EPC job for us, and where we partnership with that community to provide the people and to create the jobs in the community, and also where they're part owners of the EPC and they're full owners of the end product. So it does change. It varies completely from the need, depending on where you are and what the opportunity is.
So great. Maybe Andrea, and go to you next. Robert's emphasized kind of the own source revenues in particular, and then trying to move into some of those other benefits that you also started your presentation saying that was an initial motivation for your First Nation kind of moving in new direction. So can you just talk about, what are some of the tangible benefits that you have received from kind of the partnership with the Maritime Horizon Maritime Services, and how that kind of works out for the First Nation? Do you just want to take a moment to elaborate on that in terms of the benefits?
Yeah, for sure. The first benefit is, of course, the own source revenue, the money coming into the community, because again, the funding that we receive from the federal government is not necessarily sufficient to cover off all the activities that we want to do. Our reserve actually has 100% employment. It's in part thanks to the federal funding. However, it's also in part due to the own source revenue.
That's great. So let me just ask, Lynn, you talked about kind of the partnership with the PTEC program with this kind of, one specific community. Are you doing other work or looking to do other work in similar partnerships with other Indigenous communities, in the tech sector across Atlantic Canada? Can you just talk about kind of your broader vision? Obviously, it's very much baked into your kind of corporate priority, but I'd like to hear, Lynn, maybe just around, your current plans and prospects for extending this partnership that you've had with MEBO into other kind of communities and nations.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't have any concrete information to share today, but of course, as we continue to grow across Atlantic Canada, it is very important for us to continue these partnerships and to continue to look to build the local skill and capability. Our global PTEC program is actually going through a bit of a redesign and an adjustment coming out of the pandemic, and we had a lot of learnings. So we are paused on adding schools right now, but definitely looking to come back with a continued robust program, and we'll be anxious to spread this across Atlantic Canada at that time, built on this success.
That would be great. So Wanda, in terms of kind of MEBO's work in the past and going forward, you talked about the training side, getting that high school diploma, getting a diploma, but that critical work experience is always important. So can you just elaborate on that, the important role of work experience, the mentoring, the coaching aspect, how critical that is kind of beyond just the formal education piece?
Yeah, absolutely. It's critically important because they get to, what our plan right now is to have basically a one-on-one mentor program where the students can access industry mentors so they can see themselves in that type of line of work. The mentor can share their experiences, their knowledge, provide them an opportunity to be hands-on in that kind of work in that specific field. Sometimes it's just something as simple as knowing that you have that mentor to reach out to ask a question or to share, their career path and the education path they may have taken to get there. And our students are quite excited, I have to say, to know that they have the opportunity to intern with IBM. That's a fantastic opportunity for them, and that's what they will be doing next summer.
That's great. So maybe I'll just go back to you, Robert, and maybe kind of merge a couple of questions, and then I'll pose one to Fred. So just in terms of the natural forces partnerships, the question is around, do the First Nations groups have strictly an ownership stake, or they also have a role in operations? I know you touched on that a bit, but maybe you can just clarify that in terms of ongoing jobs for maintaining some of these projects.
Yeah, as you can understand, it is really a case-by-case basis, depending on how close we are to the First Nation, though, or the Indigenous group. Though I would say that it's not something that we're necessarily, we prefer more First Nation engagement on the job site. It's just a very long time period to get to that, where they have enough training to get it. So what we try to do at the very beginning of partnerships is engage with Indigenous group to say, it's time to leverage other ways to get community members started on the training route to be ready so that when the project goes to operation, you will have a member there that is ready to do the operations for us. And so how do we do that? Well, we offer to pay for education so that people can go to Holland College, for example, to get wind turbine training. Other ways to do that if they need to get electrical work, their electrician trade. And then what we offer is we offer the route for them to get the hands-on training. So when they have to come back, then we'll find them a spot to try to get them on tools somewhere. So that's generally how we do it. So no, it's not strictly. We do have the ownership structure, and then we also have a First Nation or Indigenous benefits plan that outlines that. But let's be honest, most of that language, unless people put the effort from the very beginning, then most of those opportunities are missed. And what happens is that in 2 years, the project's built, we haven't engaged with the youth in order to get them somebody trained and ready for that job. And then ultimately, there's nobody to take that job that we'd like them to have. So I do try to work very hard on that, but I do think that's one of the holes in the whole thing, is really getting that community engagement to want to take those jobs.
Right, and one of the specific questions is around your, the project you talked about, the 10 who helped on the construction. Were there any of those in construction trade? You've mentioned the partnership with Holland College. Have you been able to work with, the apprenticeship agency and people kind of coming into some of the apprenticeship trades around that skills development piece?
So, my knowledge of trades is fairly lacking, more on the contractual side and the executive side of things. But what we did, we had two people that were working on the turbines themselves. So they were getting the experience to be actual wind turbine installers. We tried to engage them to go and do the further training so that they could be on the operations. Unfortunately, they decided that they prefer not to do that, but that was open to them. They did get a lot of experience, and I believe that they are one of them for sure, and maybe both of them are now working on the next project, which is a 42 megawatt project near St. John that we're in partnership with. So it does continue, but as somebody also stated early on, construction jobs are kind of one-off, and I don't like them nearly as much as operations jobs because they can be a job for a life.
Absolutely. So Fred, maybe I can ask a question to you. When we did the polling at the beginning, the question opportunities for Indigenous procurement got the lowest number of responses. Can you just speak about the role or potential of Indigenous procurement and the role that partnerships might play in improving access to that and kind of building that capacity? Do you have any thoughts to share on that from my research?
Yeah, certainly, being part of the private sector supply chain, such as with natural forces as an example, helps you kind of develop that expertise, knowledge, and technical skills, and ability to meet the contractual requirements, to deliver on time and on budget. And certainly that goes a long ways in building your experience and your skills and your level of employment to be able to take on government contracts. So last year, David, the federal government committed in its new mandate to have at least 5% of federal procurement be sourced from Indigenous-owned businesses. And they announced this in early August of last year. They're going to phase it in over a 3-year period. So here in Atlantic Canada, we need to build the capacity of our Indigenous businesses in the region first in order to ensure that we actually receive about 5% of federal procurement in the Atlantic region. That's going to be the real challenge because I said on one of my slides, right now we're only getting about 0.4% of what's called the PSAB set-aside program with the federal government. So that's a long ways from 5%.
That's great, Fred. So this is your last call for questions. If there's another burning question that we haven't addressed so far in our reports and presentations, I encourage you to put that quickly in the chat. But maybe I can pose a question to all of our panelists, just around, Robert, you highlighted this issue of, some of the jobs, particularly in the projects you're working at, are off reserve or they're far from reserve. So my question for you specifically is, is that a constraint on the opportunities, or do Do you see mechanisms? You already talked about some opportunities, but do you see a way to kind of move that forward? And maybe I can just open that up then to everyone else, because Andrew, you're in a remote community. Wanda and Lynn, you're dealing with the tech sector. Many of those employment opportunities are probably not on reserve. They may be with other companies like IBM. So again, can you talk to the opportunities and how we move forward where some of the jobs may not be on reserve, and how we kind of bridge that gap or bring the jobs to the community? So Robert, I'll just speak to ask you to respond first, and then we kind of open it up for the other panelists.
Yeah, David, it's a great question. So if you remember at the beginning of what I was talking about, we have to understand where everybody is coming from. And so we never position our partnerships as job creators. That happens to be a secondary benefit that can come out of it. So it is really important at the beginning for us to understand that, both the Indigenous group and ourselves, to understand that really this is own source revenue. That's what we're looking to do here. And then as we're doing this project, let's look for those side benefits. And so Wajawson is actually a perfect example. So it's located near Sussex. Tobic First Nation is up by past Woodstock. It's quite a distance away. But Fort Folly First Nation is not very far away, which is just a little past Moncton and Sackville. And so the ability was that actually there is a First Nation vendor there that was able to provide all the security for the site throughout the whole thing. And so we do need to look a little bit more like that in terms of holistically of maybe it's not necessarily from that First Nation, maybe it's another First Nation that gets a few more of the benefits, but looking holistically like that. The second thing is that, and it was, I believe it was your number one or number two that people said, skills need to be developed. And so funding needs to be found for that. And I know that private sector is more than happy to work with federal sources to make sure that people are ready. And so go out into communities and really sell these jobs, because they are the jobs of the future. And that's very similar to what we're doing with Natural Forces Solar. And we're trying to do that with Eskasoni and some other First Nations as well.
Oh, that's great, Robert. So Andrew, any comments from your First Nation just around kind of where the jobs are located and how you make that work for your community?
Yeah, for sure. So having internet difficulties myself in a remote First Nations community, yeah, I mean, that's the crux of Miabagig Horizon Maritime Services. I mean, it's nothing but remote positions because they're at sea. So the way that the nation has approached that is essentially to, again, as has already been spoken about, leverage that own source revenue to essentially provide work at home for those who don't wish to leave, but for those who wish to leave, and it's sort of baked into the Newfoundland culture of you got to go away to go fishing, you got to go away to Fort McMurray anyway. So it's kind of that natural fit, and that's something that we've been doing for a very, very, very long time. But again, it's if they want the job and to be at sea, there's absolutely excellent careers out there for them and opportunity for advancement. If they want to stay home, they can still avail of the social programming, and that's how we've dealt with that as the nation. So not every individual life at sea is not for them. I know it's not for me. But as you say, we try to create opportunities where we can. And through that own source revenue, if they want to go out and do something else through training and education, they can absolutely do that. We want to be there as a nation to support them.
Then I don't know if either Wanda or Lynn wants to talk about kind of the PTEC program and how that works with people kind of on reserve or off reserve and where those opportunities are.
I'll speak first, Lynn. But I don't want to just talk about I'll talk about the PTEC, but I'm going to start first with MEBO. MEBO, for a number of years, have placed community members in major projects across Nova Scotia. That would be highway projects, whether it be with Dexter or Lindsay, or it's the hospital redevelopment, the Nova Scotia, the Coast Guard College. And you're right, some folks just do not want to leave community, and those that do, there are others that do. Obviously there has to be an incentive or a compensation for travel and for accommodation and such. So we work with the First Nation communities right across Nova Scotia. So if it's something that's happening on the mainland, obviously we would pull from the nearest community in that area. But you're right, there are some that do want to stay in community, and we are fortunate that we have be able to tap into funding that provides the wages for those workers to be employed, which helps the communities and helps the bands employ those folks. From the PTEC side, we do know some of our students do want to stay in community. And with the investments into infrastructure such as internet, because we do know that is a deterrent, for example, out in Eskasoni, with that being increased, it is providing them the opportunity to stay home and be able to either start their business, own business, work for IBM, work for any other industry member that provides that at-home work opportunity. But we also do have students who want to go away and experience that. But there has to be a whole structure and a whole support system built around that individual. And we're aware of that and work with the various members that would be involved with that. So there is definitely has to be recognition that there is something that needs to be in place for that, off community experience. And Robert, I would invite you, I would like to reach out to you after this, because I think the services of MEBO in our office might be beneficial to you in helping that labor force gap there. So I would love to connect you with Alex, our executive director, to chat about that further.
Oh, that's great. Well, we are at time, so I'd like to kind of just bring things to a close. I just want to thank all our panelists for sharing your insights, your perspectives. That's been really helpful. There is a survey link, evaluation form in the chat. If you could take 30 seconds to just click on that before you leave, that would be great. And we will be emailing that survey out to you. So again, we do appreciate your feedback on this. So again, thank you to Fred on all the work that his team's been doing to share this research. I thank all our guests for joining us today. I think this has been a very helpful discussion and dialogue as we all continue on this journey towards reconciliation and leveraging the assets of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities to create this healthy, inclusive, and sustainable Atlantic economy. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We will be launching our last report. You will get access to that if you're on our membership list or our subscriber list, and we will stay in touch as we continue to work on these particular types of topics. So with that, I'll close the webinar, and thank you all for joining us today.